Well, so to begin, let's return to Sonia. Now we've heard that there is concern with a number of potential risk factors, socioeconomic factors, gender factors, Sonia says are bad policy and unconstitutional. Criminal history factors may not be unconstitutional, but they import the past bias of policing and law enforcement practices. So the question is, isn't this better than what we're doing anyway? If we're not using actuarial risk assessment, aren't judges doing the exact same thing but without accountability and transparency?
So I want to first sort of contest the question that, or the premise that all we should be looking at is whether these instruments outperform the status quo. Like, we've got a pretty bad status quo in a lot of aspects of our criminal justice system, like, no doubt about that. We also have a political moment in which people are, from across the partisan spectrum, are for the first time in decades actually looking seriously at criminal justice reform in a lot of different stages. And I worry about the fact that this movement has seized on risk assessment as the tool to append to, like, just about every criminal justice reform. Like, oh, you can have this diversion from incarceration program, but only if you pass the risk assessment, right? We have this momentum, like, we can focus on actually doing things that try to fix the problems in the existing system without committing ourselves to a system that I believe is not only implicitly but explicitly discriminatory. I'm sure that it's true, it's like part of what I study in the rest of my work, that judges and other criminal justice system actors, in some cases, engage in inappropriate discrimination. I think that's something we should see as a problem rather than something that we should codify by actually explicitly putting it into a system that we tell judges to use. I also think that as an empirical question, while it's true, for example, at sentencing, it's certainly true that a defendant's poverty may be a factor that judges take into account implicitly when assessing risk. It's not, however, entirely obvious which direction those factors cut on balance, because many of the factors associated with socioeconomic disadvantage that these instruments treat as risk factors are also the types of things that defense counsel have traditionally introduced as mitigating factors in sentencing. Because they mitigate culpability, right? And judges at sentencing especially, maybe more so than decision makers at other stages of the process, are in the business of of weighing a lot of factors that are different in kind, right? Both risk reduction and general deterrence and also retributive justice and a sort of broad variety of concerns. I think there is reason to believe that the provision of quantitative risk assessments will put a thumb on the scale in favor of emphasizing risk at the expense of those other factors. And it's not that I don't think risk, by the way, is a relevant factor to consider. I'm not like making a brief for purely retributive sentencing or something. But I'm just saying that I think that when you quantify things, there's lots of evidence in other contexts that humans in general like to defer to numbers and expert reports, and especially when it sort of takes the weight off of a cognitively demanding and emotionally demanding process like sentencing. I did a little experiment just with my students, like 85 students. I split them in half. I gave them each a detailed fact pattern about 2 defendants. And in the they all had the same facts, including all the same risk factors. And what I did is I made they're basically the same crime, but I made one defendant a little bit riskier than the other, and one defendant a little bit more culpable than the other, if that makes sense, a little more morally culpable. And the only thing I changed was at the end of this page-long fact pattern, I added a sentence where I gave half of the class a risk score. And what happened was in the version without the risk score, most of my students gave a lesser sentence, or at least among the ones that didn't give them the same sentence, the vast majority gave the lesser sentence to the riskier defendant and the greater sentence to the more culpable defendant, right? That pattern dramatically reversed, and a clear 2/3 of the students in the class, or 60% of the students in the class, gave the riskier defendant the higher score when you gave them the risk score, and the rest gave them the same. So even though it was a small sample, it was like a significant and large result. Now that's just students, it's just a tiny study, but I don't think that judges necessarily react that differently, like given that there's studies of how judges respond, for instance, to expert testimony on quantitative issues in other contexts that suggests that they're similarly informed by or likely to defer to those kinds of assessments. So yeah, like I think it's an empirical question what it will do, and I'm not sure that we shouldn't be also considering other alternatives.
Your response raises the question of how judges should understand the risk scores with which they're provided, or the risk classification. So Richard, I'd like to put this question to you. When you have a risk assessment instrument in the pretrial phase or sentencing phase that produces a risk score and classifies someone as high risk, or a machine learned algorithm that classifies someone as high risk, what does that actually mean in a quantitative sense? How should judges understand that forecast?
It just tells you, it just provides an additional piece of information that's more explicit about some value of risk. And in my experience with loads of criminal justice decision makers, it's not a problem. They understand it. You can even tell them in quantitative terms how reliable that is. They understand that too. They're not stupid.
So if you were to tell them in quantitative terms, what would you tell them for your domestic violence forecasting, for instance?
In this particular case, we just provide a thumbs up or thumbs down and then a reliability count. So we say, this is someone predicted to beat this woman again, and we say the reliability is, let's say, 90, which is very high. We give them a scale. Oh yeah, well, they understand that. These aren't stupid people.